What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 5. Final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for this week's NFL slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 5. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. So top of the slate here, great matchup. You got Patrick Mahomes. But I think there's better plays on the slate than Patrick Mahomes this week. I would go with a guy like Jalen Hurts from the Philadelphia Eagles, playing the LA Rams, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing running backs or opposing quarterbacks. Jalen Hurts averaging 22.2 fantasy points per game on the season. And I said running back because this guy gets an average of 10 rush attempts per game. Gonna be about 15% owned. Projected at 22.4 fantasy points here in Week 5. He's 8,000 DraftKings salary, 600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50.5 points scored in this game. They have the Eagles favored by 4. So Jalen Hurts has scored 27, 22, and 26 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 9, 10, and 12 rush attempts in those games. So I like Jalen Hurts here versus the LA Rams. Now I also like Tua Tagovailoa from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Giants. Also have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, middle-of-the-pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Tua Tagovailoa averaging 22.9 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 2.8 rush attempts per game. Going to be about 13% owned. Projected at 20 fantasy points here tonight. So he's 7,100 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game. They have the Dolphins favored by 12.5. Now, Tua Tagovailoa scored 15, 31, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 2, 0, and 4 rush attempts. So I like Tua Tagovailoa here versus the New York Giants. Now, coming down in salary here, I also like Joe Burrow from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Arizona Cardinals. Now, Joe Burrow only averaging 8.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2 rush attempts per game. He is going to be about 11% owned, projected at 17.8 fantasy points here in Week 5. He's 6,200 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Bengals favored by 3. So Joe Burrow hasn't played well so far this season, but we know he has 20 plus fantasy point upside. He's a good quarterback. He's got a good wide receiver core as well. And he's got a good matchup here this week. So I like Joe Burrow here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Okay guys, it's time to announce the winner of our $25 weekly PayPal giveaway, and the winner is Demetrius Barnes. Congratulations, Demetrius Barnes. You are the winner of this week's $25 weekly PayPal giveaway. Please reply to our comment to collect your prize.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So, stud on the slate, you got Saquon Barkley, but he's questionable here this week. Only going to be about 2% owned, so it looks like people are staying away from Saquon Barkley due to that questionable tag. So take a look at Bijan Robinson from the Atlanta Falcons playing the Houston Texans, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Bijan Robinson averaging 19.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 13.3 rush attempts per game and 5.5 pass targets per game. Been on the field for 73% of the snaps. Going to be about 25% owned. Projected at 18.1 fantasy points here in week 5. He's 7,700 DraftKings salary, 500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41.5 points scored in this game. They have the Falcons favored by 1.5. Now, Bijan Robinson has scored 22, 10, and 24 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 14, 10, and 19 rush attempts, on top of 5, 6, and 5 pass targets. So I like to see that he's involved in the passing game here. So I like Bijan Robinson here versus the Houston Texans. Now, if you want to take a look at another running back in a high-scoring game here, who's getting some pretty decent volume in the passing game, take a look at Kyren Williams from the LA Rams playing the Philadelphia Eagles, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they are good against opposing running backs. But Kyren Williams averaging 21.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 16 rush attempts per game and 5.5 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 82% of the snaps, going to be about 14% owned, projected at 13.8 fantasy points here in week 5. He's 6,700 DraftKings salary, 1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50.5 points scored in this game, with the Rams favored by 4. The Rams trailing by 4. So Kyren Williams scored 31, 9, and 28 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 25, 10, and 14 rush attempts, on top of 3, 7, and 10 pass targets. So I like Kyren Williams here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Now I also like David Montgomery from the Detroit Lions playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. David Montgomery averaging 21.3 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 23 rush attempts per game and 1 pass target. Going to be about 13% owned. He's projected at 13.8 fantasy points here in week 5. He's 6,600 DraftKings salary, 1,900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44 points scored in this game. They have the Lions favored by 9.5. And David Montgomery scored 37 fantasy points last game at 32 rush attempts and 2 pass targets. And that was after taking a game off. He was out for a week, came back strong. Could be a running game script here. So I like David Montgomery here versus the Carolina Panthers. Lots of good running backs on the slate this week. A lot of good value plays, mid-range plays at running back. You got Joe Mixon from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have the 7th worst defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Joe Mixon averaging 11.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.8 rush attempts per game,
and 3.3 pass targets per game. So the volume's been there. The production's been struggling a little bit. He's been on the field for 74% of the snaps. Going to be about 21% owned. Projected at 15 fantasy points here this week. He's 6,400 DraftKings salary, 600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game. They have the Bengals favored by 3. So Joe Mixon has scored 9, 14, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 14, 19, and 13 rush attempts in those games, on top of 1, 2, and 5 pass targets. So it could be a breakout week here. So I like Joe Mixon here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Now, lots of other running backs in the slate. I also like Alvin Kamara, Raheem Mostert, Devon Achane, DeAndre Swift, James Conner. So lots of running backs to pick from here this week. But take a look at Alvin Kamara from the New Orleans Saints playing the New England Patriots. Now, I know it's a bad matchup. The Patriots have a good defense. They've been pretty good versus opposing running backs. But Alvin Kamara averaging 21.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11 rush attempts per game and 14 pass targets per game. So, looks like he just played last week. I don't know why his season average for targets is so high. Let's just dig into this here. Let's go to his scoring log. Yeah, so Alvin Kamara, okay, yeah, so last week was his first week of playing this season. So he had 21 fantasy points off of 14 pass targets and 11 rush attempts. So that's why his averages are so high. So he's been on the field for 100% of the snaps. That's pretty impressive. Last game, apparently was on the field for all of the offensive possessions. Going to be about 19% owned. Projected at 15 fantasy points here this week. He's 6,300 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel. Now, Vegas only thinks there's going to be 39 points scored in this game. They have the Saints trailing by 1. But I like Alvin Kamara here versus the New England Patriots.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. Stud on the slate with the best matchup is Tyreek Hill from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Giants, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Tyreek Hill has averaged 26.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 69% of the snaps, going to be about 24% owned, projected at 21.3 fantasy points here in week 5. He's 9,000 DraftKings salary, 400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game. They have the Dolphins favored by 12.5. So Tyreek Hill scored 10, 34, and 15 fantasy points in his last 3 games off of 5, 11, and 9 pass targets. So I like Tyreek Hill here versus the New York Giants. Now, the other studs on the slate, Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown, both those guys, good plays, not as good matchups, but monster volume on all 3 of those wide receivers. Then you got a guy like Jamar Chase from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Arizona Cardinals. If you're going to be playing Joe Burrow, you could stack on Jamar Chase here, who's averaging 15.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10.3 pass targets per game, on the field for 96% of the snaps, going to be about 22% owned, projected at 18.9 fantasy points here in week 5. So he's $7,900 DraftKings salary, $800 more on FanDuel. So Jamar Chase has scored 14, 29, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 9, 15, and 8 pass targets. So I like Jamar Chase here versus the Arizona Cardinals. So just like running back, lots of good mid-range wide receivers on this slate. You got guys like Michael Pittman Jr., Garrett Wilson, DeAndre Hopkins, Zay Flowers, Tutu Atwell, Adam Thielen. So let's go over DeAndre Hopkins. Take a look at this. From the Tennessee Titans playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have the 6th worst defense overall, give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. DeAndre Hopkins averaging 9.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.8 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 65% of the snaps, gonna be about 10% owned, projected at 13.8 fantasy points here in week 5. Only $5,700 DraftKings salary, $400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game. They have the Titans favored by 2.5. Now, DeAndre Hopkins scored 10, 8, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 6, 7, and 5 pass targets. So I think he's a good value play here, averaging 7.8 pass targets per game on the season. He's bound to have a breakout game here this season. Could come here in a good matchup. So I like DeAndre Hopkins here versus the Indianapolis Colts. Okay, moving on to the tight end position here. So stud on the slate, Travis Kelce. Coming down in salary, you got TJ Hawkinson. But I'm going to come down in salary even more here. Take a look at Sam Laporta from the Detroit Lions playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They've been pretty good versus opposing tight ends. But Sam Laporta averaging 13.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.8 pass targets per game. Been on the field for 80% of the snaps, going to be about 17% owned, projected at 11.2 fantasy points here tonight or here this week. He's $5,000 DraftKings salary, $1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44 points scored in this game. They have the Lions favored by 9.5. Sam Laporta, he scored 10, 22, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 5, 11, and 6 pass targets. So I like Sam Laporta here versus the Carolina Panthers. Now I also like Tyler Higbee from the LA Rams playing the Philadelphia Eagles, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Tyler Higbee averaging 8.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.5 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 93% of the snaps, going to be about 10% owned, projected at 8.7 fantasy points here in week 5. He's $4,100 DraftKings salary, $1,200 more on FanDuel. He's got a good game script lined up here. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50.5 points scored in this game, with the Rams trailing by 4, and a fantastic matchup here. Tyler Higbee has scored 11, 12, and 4 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 11, 5, and 7 pass targets. So getting plenty of volume. So I like Tyler Higbee here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Now another low-priced tight end here that's in a good spot is Zach Ertz from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, give up the third most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Zach Ertz, averaging 8.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.5 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 70% of the snaps, going to be about 13% owned, projected at 9.3 fantasy points here this week. He's only 3,500 DraftKings salary, 1,600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game. They have the Cardinals trailing by 3. So Zach Ertz scored 11, 3, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 10, 2, and 8 pass targets. Just looks drastically underpriced for his matchup and his upside. So I like Zach Ertz here versus the Cincinnati Bengals.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again and good luck.